20 questions in 20 minutes about food preservation. Can we do it? Hey folks, it's Darcy from the Purposeful Pantry. Today I'm going to be running some errands. I'm going to be working from home, and I've got answers to 20 questions that viewers and readers have asked about food preservation, mostly dehydrating, a little canning. Let's see if we can do it in 20 minutes. All right, so Karen P asks, do I recommend a good dehydrator? In fact, Karen, I recommend a wide range of them depending on your budget, your space, and the amount of food you want to process. To make this quick and easy, I'm going to recommend my three favorites. Cosori Premium Stainless Steel, which is a good budget-friendly machine that's in the mid-range. It's so quiet. An Excalibur dehydrator, I recommend the 3900 series where there's no timer. It's just the dial for temperature. It's not digital. It's on the lower end of price point, and it's a great machine. Then there's LEM, Advanco, Magic Mill, and there are so many more, and a good budget friendly, like on the low end, Nesco is a good brand. So if you really aren't quite sure what you want to spend and what the benefits are, check that post down below. All right, Janice D asks, can you dehydrate store-bought frozen potato dices? Yes, in fact you can, and there is little preparation because they're already blanched for you. So there's nothing you have to do. Just pour them out on your trays, dehydrate them at 125 until they're done. You can also do hash browns that way too. The only thing that you have to look for is that if any of those products have oil in them, you don't want to store them for long term. So you want to use them pretty quickly, push them forward in your storage so that you don't have to worry about the oil turning rancid over time. That's what makes frozen vegetables so great as a way to build up your pantry quicker. Garden Jen's Journey asks, can you dehydrate broth? And in fact, you can. Right below, I'll have a link in the description box and up here in the iCards of a video I did a few months ago on how to dehydrate vegetable broth, which works also for chicken broth or meat, any kind of beef broth that you're doing. But the gist of it is you want to make your broth, you want to reduce your broth by a lot, down almost into a syrup to make it easy. Then you're going to dry it. You're going to break it up into shards, or you're going to go ahead and powder it, and then you've got it used for any time that you need it in the future. The concentrate, though, makes a great way to store your broth if you don't want to have all those canning jars in your pantry or taking up freezer space. All right, Jensen M asks, why is it recommended to keep dehydrated meat in the freezer, but jerky is fine? Well, in fact, Jensen, even jerky is recommended to store in the freezer if you're going to do it for any amount of time other than the first couple of weeks. The National Center for Home Food Preservation says for best results, put all of your meat that's dehydrated in the freezer so that you don't run the risk of rancidity in your meats, because all meats still have some fat in them. Even the leanest cuts of beef will have some fat in them. And also, if you haven't cured that meat, it's still not shelf stable. Jerky is always recommended by the safest standards to store in the freezer over time, just as any other meats are. Karen P asks, are there tips to drying in high humidity? My fruit seems to take days. Yeah, I'm feeling you, Karen, because fruit just does take longer than vegetables because it's got so much more moisture to pull out. And when you add high humidity to it, it just takes longer because the machine can't transfer that humidity into your room as quickly as if you were in a low humidity environment or like someplace in the desert where they have almost no humidity. So as you can see, we're about to get the storm. So our humidity is higher right now than normal. And it's like, I think in the 70-80% going to be that way for the most part. So if you have an option to dry in a place where you have air conditioning, that helps a lot because your air conditioner actually works to control the humidity in your home. If you don't, a dehumidifier can work. Don't open your windows because you're just introducing more humidity into your room than if you had them shut. A fan can help. If you do want to run a fan next to your dehydrator that points out an open window to help push some of that air out, that might help depending on the actual humidity levels outside, but just be prepared that it's just going to take a little longer. Now, if you cut your fruit a little thinner, you're going to have more pieces to dry that are thinner, and smaller pieces will dry a little faster than thicker pieces will. If you're doing berries, make sure that you've broken those skins, cut them in half, do whatever you need to do to make it happen a little faster. Karen M asks, I want to use spinach from my garden for smoothies and normally freeze it to put it in. But I'd like to do powders, but have read that you can't do powder too far in advance. What do I do? Karen, here are a couple of tips. Yes, you can do powders in advance. Typically, powders last about 6 to 9 months on the more conservative scale about how long you can keep powders. So yeah, you can do your powders and then use them for the next year. They're going to be fine. The thing about using powders versus frozen in smoothies is that frozen spinach will give your smoothie the bulk that your spinach powder will not. The powder will be there, but it won't get bulky the same way that when you do spinach leaves themselves. Margaret asks, I want to make veggie capsules. Is there a ratio that you should use? Hi, Margaret. There is no ratio that you have to use. You can use whatever you happen to have in your cabinet. You can mix and match. You can just do whatever you'd like. I've got a video down below about how I do veggie capsules. I use green powder a lot too to add to that. And in fact, you can use whatever you want. You can mix vegetable powder with green powder. So there is no actual ratio. Now, I'm sure somebody's got some kind of ratio out there about what super green and the super beet powders are, but just use whatever you have on hand. It doesn't really matter. Just fill them up and take them. All right, Mary C. asks, is there a ratio that I should use from dry to fresh? So here's the deal. I'm going to put an image right here when I edit this. The ratio in general is 1 cup fresh equals 1/4 cup to 1/3 cup dry equals about a tablespoon powder. That's the good ratio you can use for just about anything all the way through. After that, it's just going to be learn how to adjust for your taste and for what your recipe might call for, but that's a good general equation to use for the ratio of fresh to dry. Marie P. asks, when using a dehydrator outside, does it attract critters, add to the time, etc., etc., etc.? Okay, when you're dehydrating things outside, just remember that your humidity needs to be low. You don't want it above like 60% because your machine has to work harder to push that humidity out of the machine into the atmosphere. And if it's really humid outside, it can't transfer well. You want it to be not too cold because the machine has to work so much harder to keep that temperature going when it's cold outside. So while you can do it, it just puts stress on your motor that will cause your machine not to last as long. Generally, you won't attract many critters because the air and the noise of the machine coming to it won't be a problem. Now, if you're out in bear country, then no, I would never do it out in bear country like that if you have to worry about it. But generally, you won't get critters. And it doesn't add to the time unless you have one of those things that like with the humidity or with the temperature, if it's not in a good state, you will add time to that because it's just having to work so much harder. The other thing to remember is don't have it in the sun, like don't have it in direct sunlight, and don't use an extension cord that isn't recommended for your machine. So plug it into an approved outlet outside only. Angie W. asks, some of my dehydrated food is crispy when dry, but after storage begins to soften. Is it still safe? Angie, a lot of times this happens if you use a jar that's too large, if you didn't condition before you put it away for storage, because conditioning helps balance that humidity that's in your jar, and it helps you check for things that might need to go back into your dehydrator. So while you're checking a couple of things on trays when you're drying, and then you put it in a jar, there may be other things within those trays that weren't dry enough. So conditioning helps kind of equalize that humidity, and you might see that things have softened up a bit while they're in the jar. Also, if you're putting product that's about this much into a jar that's this big, you've got all that extra air and moisture that's there that's going to also transfer into your food. It's going to equalize in the jar, and it may cause some things to soften. And also, over time, some things just will soften because it's just the way that things happen. It's still safe. The only time you have to worry about it is if you see mold in your jar. And if you see a little bit of mold in one place, you've got to toss everything in the jar, because just because you see it here doesn't mean it hasn't started growing other tendrils down in other places in the jar that you just can't see yet. So yes, it's perfectly safe. If you want to, you can always throw it back into the dehydrator to dry a little longer, condition it again, and then put it on your shelf. But for the most part, like I find that fruit actually tends to sometimes get a little softer over time because it's just the way it is. And Sarah J asks, when is dry enough with fruit? Because fruits are all different, there's going to be different ways to tell what fruit is dry at what stage. So for a lot of fruit, leathery, pliable is a good indicator. So that means that when you're touching it, it feels leathery. It's not sticky or tacky. It's pliable, meaning that it's not bendy, but you can still have a little give in it. With other fruit, you actually want it to break because you're looking for that kind of crisp thing. Like with apples, you want it to be crispy because you want to make sure it's fully dry. For berries, you're looking at a dry consistency that when you cut one open, you can look inside and there is no moisture on the inside. For a lot of fruits, you actually want it to be shriveled because a lot of berries, you want it to be shriveled because you're looking at storage. Now, if you want something that's softer, you can certainly dry it a little softer, but you need to store it in the freezer for longer term because any moisture that's still in that fruit will eventually turn to mold. Or dry it a little further, and then when you're wanting to eat it, pull it out ahead of time, let it sit in a Ziploc baggie with a just like damp paper towel in the baggie, and it will absorb some of that moisture and become a little softer. So it might be more beneficial for you for chewing. But for the most part, you want dry, pliable, leathery results out of most of your fruit. Now remember, it will change. So I'm going to drop a link in the description box below that will lead you to a place where you can see all of the fruits and know how they should be when they're dry. Eva B asks, should I freeze my greens before dehydrating to make powders? They work better for me. How do you do it? Well, it doesn't matter really, Eva. I don't do any pre-treatment to my greens before I dry them when they're going to powder, because for me, it's just faster and easier to save a step of messing up dishes or taking up freezer space I don't have. So I just throw them on the dehydrator and run them. You can freeze them ahead of time. You can also blanch them ahead of time if you want to, but that's not necessary. What that does is it breaks down the fibers that are in those greens, especially the ones that have thicker fibers like kale and some mustard greens and things like that. And it makes them a little more pliable, a little easier to dry. So do it however it works best for you, because it doesn't take away from it, nor does it add to it any way that you do it. Jennifer P asks, how do you keep your candy rings and lids from getting rusty? Mostly the best way to do it is just make sure that you dry them thoroughly after you pull them out of your canner. So when you pull things out of your canner, you want to leave those rings on while it cools down and that you've tested. Once you're ready, take those rings off, rinse them off really well, and then dry them. Dry them within an inch of their life. A good tip that I do is I put them in my dehydrator, just run it on low, just let it dry everything out. And that way I don't have to sit and work with a towel trying to get everything dry. But that's the absolute best way that you can do it. Rena asks, can you dehydrate turnips? I want to use them for soups. Yeah, you can. Just go ahead and cook it thoroughly, dice it up, dry it, and then condition it and store it, and just throw it into your soup when you're ready. When it's in the soup, allow it to have enough time to simmer in that soup to fully rehydrate. That will make it better than anything. If you blanch it first, and to save yourself the time of actually cooking it all the way through, you can do that. But remember, it's going to need time to rehydrate and then time to cook before you actually serve it. Because when you just blanch, all that's done is stop the enzymatic process from causing foods to degrade faster in storage, but it still needs that time to cook before it's servable. Corinne asks, can I process 2 different items in a canner if the processing times are the same? And yes, of course you can, because that's how you do small batch canning. If you only have a few things to do at a time, sorry about the jitter, you can process as long as the processing time is exactly the same. You don't want to mix vegetables with meats unless you're planning on those vegetables processing the full time the meats process. Debbie H asks, do I need a candy thermometer to make marmalade? A candy thermometer is really helpful because, especially as you're beginning, you may not really have a good idea of what the sheet tests are to tell if the jam is ready to go ahead and process. So a candy thermometer can help. They're pretty inexpensive, and it can just help you develop that certainty that you're doing it correctly. Now, there is the sheet test that you do with either an ice cold spoon, which is more helpful to have it ice cold than just pulling it off a regular spoon, or you can put a plate or other kind of freezer safe item, flat item into the freezer, get it good and cold, a spoon too. When you're pulling it out, you can either spoon some onto the plate or you can use your spoon, dip it into the jam for just a little bit, the marmalade jam, whatever you're working with. Allow it a minute to cool. And if you start seeing it coming off the spoon in a sheet or like in flakes, it's ready. If it's just dripping, it's not quite ready yet. So you're looking for that sheeting action. On the plate, you can put a little mound of jam or marmalade onto your plate, allow it to sit there for a minute to cool off. Then when you nudge it, if the top of it crinkles up like it's formed a skin, then it's ready to go. If it's still just fluid, you need some more time in your cooking. Kimber B asks, I need more help getting my Tattler lids rings to seal. I've tried multiple times, followed instructions, watched videos, and my seal rate is only about 1 in 4. I really want to get them to work. Kimber, because I don't know what you're doing, I'm not there with you, I can't tell exactly what you're doing, I'm just going to give some tips about how to make them work and hope that this helps you in case you missed one of them along the way. It's helpful to not do meats in your jars that are with Tattlers, because I've heard a lot of experience from people who are way more experienced at canning than I am, that there's something about that grease that can come up, the fats coming up out of the meat as it pulls the atmosphere out of your jar, that can cause those seals to not seal well because it gets on the rim. No matter how much you cleaned it ahead of time, just the act of pulling that out can sometimes make it happen. Also, when you're putting your cans in the canner, have your ring for it set not super tight. You want to give it even less than finger tight almost. You just want to barely put it on so that it has room to adjust as the atmosphere is changing in those cans. In those jars, sorry. Then as you pull the jar out and you're going to put it on the counter to cool off, tighten it, because that's the point. You want it to have the pressure from the top to seal as it's pulled down, as the atmosphere inside the jar adjusts. So those are a couple of ways that you can make sure it happens, is that you should use it on those things that you don't intend to put away for very long-term storage, especially with meats. Use them for your shorter-term things, because then if it breaks and you can catch it, you can use it. If you put it back for long-term storage and you aren't checking quickly enough, because the failure rate could be a little higher, that you might waste more food. So think about it that way. Also, make sure that you've cleaned that rim off completely, that your jar has no cracks, no chips, no imperfections in the rim at all. Make sure it's very clean, and that should help. Mom Vanup asked about dehydrating for an RV. There's no difference in dehydrating for an RV versus dehydrating for anyone else. The only thing that can change for that is that because you're doing a much shorter term time, maybe if you're not on the road full time all year long, but you're only there maybe for maybe a weekend, or you go out for a week or two, you can actually store things in containers that might not necessarily be what we suggest for long-term storage. So you can do some shorter-term storage ideas in Ziploc bags for things that aren't quite so susceptible to moisture. You can use some less approved plastic things that are easier to store in your space. You can go with a smaller dehydrator if you want to dehydrate while you're in your RV. And there's like the smaller stackables that can be used, or even the Sahara by Broad & Taylor. That's a collapsible one so that you can tuck it away when you're not using it. So I'd really concentrate on looking at those hiking and backpacking websites, because they will give you a ton of information on doing meals that are for short-term, things like that aren't necessarily meant for long-term storage. So you can do meats and you can do full meals that might need to be stored in the freezer for long-term, that you can pull out, have available for a week or two, that are going to be just fine. So I hope that helps a little bit. Okay, our last 3 questions that are not by a specific person but are asked all the time in the group, and I just wanted to go ahead and add them here. 1, can I dehydrate on plastic canvas that you get at the craft store? The answer is a qualified yes, but no. Those plastic sheets that you use for doing needle crafts are not food safe, which means that the manufacturers did not create them with food in mind, so that they may contain BPA. They may contain other contaminants in it that would transfer to your food. I know that people do it, and I'm not going to tell you not to do it. I'm just telling you that is the risk that you take. Can I dehydrate peanut butter? No, you cannot. Peanut butter contains too much oil in it to actually dehydrate. Peanut butter powder that you can buy from the store is done from a different process, where it is the byproduct of creating peanut oil. So they extract all the oil out of the peanuts, then they have this pulp that's left over that they dry in a commercial process and then make available for us to purchase. I've got a link on my blog that I'll leave down in the description box below that tells you a lot of ways that you can use peanut butter powder, and it's a great product to have in your long-term food storage, but it's not something that you can create at home. And the last question is this: why is it that when I dry my food according to the time in my manual, it's always not done? The problem is that many manuals are not written by people who actually dehydrate. They're written by a manufacturer who creates a manual for the machine they created. The machine is easy to create. The how-to book isn't. And there are also some issues that affect your drying outside of that. It's the humidity in your home, the actual power of your machine. Lower wattage machines are going to take longer to dry than higher wattage machines, no matter what the manual says as far as the time. It's also the humidity of your food and how you prepared it. So if you have a freshly picked, ripe tomato that just came off the vines after you've watered it that morning, that tomato will probably have more moisture in it than one that you got from the store that's been sitting out for 3 or 4 days at a store before you ever get it home. And so the drying times are just going to be different. So you need to learn to dry on the basis of if the food is done, not what the timer says. Okay, so I hope those questions have helped you. If you have any more questions, if you want clarification, please leave a comment down below and I'll answer it. And I'm sure other people will chip in with their responses too. If you'd like to learn more about dehydrating, you can check out this video right here, and I'll see you next time. Happy dehydrating.